Thank you for joining the virtual service of the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship on the Emerald Coast. I'm Charlene Farley, and a member of this fellowship and your service leader this morning. Whether this is your 100th time here or your very first time, you are truly welcomed. Our UU faith has a liberal theology that welcomes everyone, regardless of their race, skin color, age, physical or mental disabilities, or who they love. We believe that the truth can be found in all sacred texts, and while we have no creedal requirements for membership in our fellowship, we encourage everyone to engage in a responsible search for truth and meaning, while respecting the inherent worth and dignity of every human being. If you're not presently subscribing to our weekly e-news, we hope that you will do so. Email admin@uufec.com to get on our mailing list, and check out our uufec.com website and find more information about us. Donations to support our charitable work is greatly appreciated. Checks payable to UUFEC may be mailed to UUFEC, Post Office Box 205, Valparaiso, Florida 32580. We continue now with the lighting of the chalice, a symbol of our UU faith.
By Maureen Killeran. In these hard times, let us look first to the response of love. In the midst of challenge, may our chalice flame bear witness to the inherent worth and dignity of every human being. In the midst of uncertainty, may our chalice be a beacon of encouragement, that our values may guide our choices. Let us look first to the response of love.
Still and small, deep inside all, I hear you call, singing. In dark and rain, sorrow and pain, still you remain, singing. Calming my fears, quenching my tears, through all the years, singing. Voice still and small, deep inside all, I hear you call, singing. In dark and rain, sorrow and pain, still you remain, singing. Calming my fears, quenching my tears, through all the years, singing.
Hi, I'm Amanda Pyburn, a member of this fellowship, and I have a story for you today about enemies. Now, I know we're supposed to always like everyone and be nice to everyone, but every now and then, don't you meet somebody that you just don't like? You might even dislike them enough to call them your enemy. Well, this story is going to teach you how to get rid of enemies forever. It's called Enemy Pie. Let me share my screen and bring it up. Enemy pie. It should have been a perfect summer. My dad helped me build a tree house in our backyard. My sister was away at camp for 3 whole weeks. And I was on the best baseball team in town. It should have been a perfect summer, but it wasn't. It was all good until Jeremy Ross moved into the neighborhood, right next door to my best friend Stanley. I did not like Jeremy Ross. He laughed at me when I got struck out in the baseball game. He had a party on his trampoline and I wasn't even invited. But my best friend Stanley was. Jeremy Ross was the one and only person on my enemy list. I never even had an enemy list until he moved into the neighborhood. But as soon as he came along, I needed one. I hung it up in my treehouse where Jeremy Ross would never be allowed to go. Dad understood stuff like enemies. He told me when he was my age, he had enemies too, but he knew of a way to get rid of them. I asked him to tell me how. Tell you how? I'll show you how, he said. He pulled a really old recipe book off the kitchen shelf. Inside, there was a worn out scrap of paper with faded writing. Dad held it up and squinted. Enemy pie, he said, satisfied. You may be wondering exactly what is in enemy pie. I was wondering too, but Dad said the recipe was so secret he couldn't even tell me. I decided it must be magic. I begged him to tell me something, anything. I will tell you this, he said. Enemy pie is the fastest known way to get rid of enemies. Now, of course, this got my mind working. What kind of things, disgusting things, would I put into a pie for an enemy? I brought Dad some weeds from the garden, but he just shook his head. I brought him earthworms and rocks, but he didn't think he'd need those. I even gave him the gum I'd been chewing all morning. He gave it right back to me. So I went outside to play, alone. I shot baskets until the ball got stuck on the roof. I threw a boomerang that never came back to me. And all the while I listened to the sounds of my dad chopping and stirring and blending the ingredients of enemy pie. This could be a great summer after all. Enemy pie was going to be awful. I tried to imagine how horrible it must smell, or worse yet, what it would look like. But when I was in the backyard looking for ladybugs, I smelled something really, really, really good. As far as I could tell, it was coming from our kitchen. I was a bit confused. I went in to ask Dad what was wrong. Enemy pie shouldn't smell this good. But Dad was smart. If enemy pie smelled bad, your enemy would never eat it, he said. I could tell. He'd made enemy pie before. The buzzer rang and Dad put on his oven mitts and pulled the pie out of the oven. It looked like plain old pie. It looked good enough to eat. I was catching on. But still, I wasn't really sure how this enemy pie thing worked. What exactly would it do to my enemies? Maybe it made their hair fall out or their breath stinky. Maybe it even made bullies cry. I asked Dad, but he was no help. He wouldn't tell me a thing. But while the pie cooled, he filled me in on my job. He talked quietly. There is one part of enemy pie that I can't do. In order for it to work, you have to spend the whole day with your enemy. Even worse, you have to be nice to him. It's not easy, but that's the only way that enemy pie can work. Are you sure you want to go through with this? I was sure. It sounded horrible and scary, but it was worth a try. All I had to do was spend one day being nice to Jeremy Ross, and then he would be out of my hair forever. I rode my bike to his house and knocked on the door. When Jeremy opened the door, he seemed surprised. He stood on the other side of the screen door and just looked at me, waiting for me to say something. I was nervous. Can you play? I asked. He looked confused. I'll go ask my mom, he said. He came back with his shoes in his hands. His mom walked around the corner to say hello. You boys stay out of trouble, she said, smiling. Well, we rode bikes for a while and played on his trampoline. Then we made some water balloons and threw them at the neighbor girls. We missed every time. Jeremy's mom made us lunch, and after lunch, we went over to my house. It seemed strange, but I was kind of having fun with my enemy. He almost seemed nice. But of course, I couldn't tell Dad that. He had worked so hard to make enemy pie. Jeremy Ross liked my basketball hoop. He said he wished he had one, but they didn't have room. I let him win a game just to be nice. Jeremy Ross even knew how to throw a boomerang. He threw it and it came right back to him. I threw it and it went over my house and into the backyard. When we climbed over the fence to find it, the first thing Jeremy noticed was my tree house. He wanted to go up. I couldn't let him. Do you remember what's hanging on the wall of his tree house? Oh, the enemy list. But he did teach me how to throw a boomerang, and he did have me over for lunch, and he did let me play on his trampoline. He wasn't being a very good enemy. Okay, I said, but hold on. I climbed up ahead of him and tore the enemy list off the wall. I had a checkerboard and some cards in the treehouse, and we played games until my dad called us down for dinner. We pretended we didn't hear him, and when he came out to get us, we tried to hide from him. It was fun, but somehow he found us. Dad had made macaroni and cheese for dinner, my favorite. It was Jeremy's favorite too. Maybe Jeremy Ross wasn't so bad after all. I was beginning to think maybe we should just forget about that enemy pie. But sure enough, after dinner, Dad brought it out and started cutting thick slices. Dad, I said, it sure is nice having a new friend in the neighborhood. I was trying to get his attention and trying to tell him that Jeremy Ross was no longer my enemy. But Dad only smiled and nodded. I think he thought I was just pretending. Dad dished up 3 plates with big pieces of pie and big scoops of ice cream. He passed one to me and one to Jeremy. Wow, said Jeremy, looking at the pie. My dad never makes pie like this. I began to panic. I didn't want Jeremy to eat that enemy pie. He was my friend. Jeremy, stop, don't eat it. It's bad pie. I think it's poisonous or something. Jeremy's fork stopped before reaching his mouth. He crumpled his eyebrows and looked at me funny. I felt relieved. I had saved his life. I was a hero. If it's so bad, he said, then why has your dad already eaten half of his? I turned to look at my dad. Sure enough, he was eating the enemy pie. Good stuff, he mumbled through a mouthful, and that was all he said. I sat there watching them eat that enemy pie. Dad was laughing. Jeremy seemed fine. Neither of them was losing any hair. Seemed safe enough, so I took a tiny taste. Enemy pie was delicious. After dessert, Jeremy rode his bike home, but not before inviting me over to play on his trampoline in the morning. He said he'd teach me how to flip. As for enemy pie, I still don't know how to make it. I still wonder if enemies really do hate it, or their hair falls out, or their breath turns stinky. But I don't know if I'll ever get an answer, because I just lost my best enemy. And here's how they are now. So I bet you caught on to the secret. The only way to get rid of an enemy is to turn that person into a friend. And the only way you can do that is by being nice to them and maybe really getting to know them. So often the people we think we don't like, we just don't really know well enough yet. And they don't know us yet. So give it a try. Good luck making new friends. Bye.
May you be filled with loving kindness. May you be whole. My husband, Bill, was a high school student in Birmingham, Alabama, during the early attempts at desegregation. As a young white man, he struggled between following the message he learned at home that Jesus loved everyone, including Black people, while trying to hold his own against other students who believed that integration was against God's law and to be fought at all costs. He found himself in numerous confrontations, both verbal and physical, and often with his nemesis, Charles. Events such as a drive-by egging were a regular part of the ongoing war between them. The odor of rotten egg still lurks in Bill's memory. Charles was the son of a local Ku Klux Klan leader. When Bill's father was observed routinely giving rides to the Black gentleman he worked with in that spring of 1969, it was decided that some visible response was in order to this inappropriate racial mixing. One night after dinner, Bill and his family were surprised looking out their front window to see a cross burning in their front yard. I know, it sounds terrifying, but Bill and his parents were not easily frightened. Bill suspected that his school rival was behind it, and the family quickly decided to address the display with, in Bill's words, the seriousness it deserved. They grabbed tools and supplies and gathered around the burning cross in front of their appalled neighbors to roast marshmallows. You see, the burning cross was only about 2 feet high. Clearly, junior Klansman Charles had put minimal effort into this first incendiary attempt at intimidation. I imagine his daddy was mighty disappointed. Only a few weeks later, there was another violent and dramatic event which brought the two families into close company. Charles's mother was knocked down by a hit-and-run driver in the middle of the day, right up the street from my husband's family home. People came running to assist, including my husband and his parents. Bill directed traffic down the block, and his mother and father knelt on the pavement and took care of the poor woman as she lay injured in the street. Yes, everyone knew who everyone was. And yes, my future in-laws believed in the Christian principle of love that applies to everyone, and particularly those who behave as enemies. So my future husband and his parents treated the mother of Bill's worst enemy during that period in the history of racial struggle in Birmingham, Alabama, as a neighbor, and offered her the same concern and care they would have offered anyone. Remember the line from the movie The Godfather 2 where Michael Corleone leans in and says, "Keep your friends close and your enemies closer." It's usually thought of as a defensive strategy for conflict or even battle. But what if we take this phrase from that context and apply it to the environment of the church? We know that everyone comes to church at least in part to be with friends and to make new ones. Ideally, people attend church to enrich their spiritual lives and to join others in justice work. But the church growth consultants tell us that if a new member doesn't make friends within 6 months, they probably won't keep attending. So making and interacting with friends, with those in whose company we feel comfortable, is very important to each of us for making our church experience rich and satisfying. But what about those people we don't like? The ones who make us uncomfortable, the ones who voted against us at the last congregational meeting or seem to undermine the programs that we hold dear. We may not think of them exactly as enemies, but we certainly don't think of them as friends. What do we do about those people? Almost all the world's religions teach something about the value and power of loving our enemies. From Islam, the Quran tells us it may be that God will ordain love between you and those you hold as enemies. The Hindu epic Ramayana teaches that a superior being does not render evil for evil. A noble soul will ever exercise compassion even towards those who enjoy injuring others, for who is without fault. Oh, I know. We UUs are highly evolved people who take pride in our intellectual ability and our collective moral compass. We don't use such archaic language to describe people with whom we interact. Perhaps we don't really get along with certain people who can be difficult. We might talk about being less than friendly or having distant connections, but we don't use the language of enemies, do we? The ancient Jewish book of Proverbs exhorts people to rejoice not when your enemy falls, and let not your heart be glad when they stumble. And if your enemy is hungry, give them bread to eat. If they are thirsty, give them water to drink. Enemy is a word indicating the perception of opposition and evoking extreme emotion. Similar words imbued with less negative power might be adversary or rival or antagonist. An adversary could be someone we find irritating or difficult to get along with. There are plenty of people in our lives and in our churches who might be described as controlling, condescending, know-it-all, manipulative, two-faced, untrustworthy, power-hungry. Of course, we all know such people, even in our beloved community, right? Churches are populated not with angels, but with human beings who are far from perfect. Also, churches are supposed to be places of welcome and hospitality, and they attract folk who are often unwelcome elsewhere because of their flaws and faults. Sometimes we may feel like such people just antagonize the stew out of us. In the Christian Bible, Rabbi Jesus taught his friends, love your enemies, bless them who curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you. Well, how the heck are we supposed to do that? A challenger of the moment might be a stranger we encounter randomly who is having a really bad day and we just got in their way. I once pulled up to a gas pump and got out to discover myself facing an enraged woman who thought it was her turn next. And even though the pump next to mine opened immediately, she let loose a tirade of loud, insulting, rude language, the likes of which I have rarely heard outside of a church board meeting. There are people who seem to be friends until something happens which brings pressure to bear, and the friend turns on us without warning or abandons us in our time of need. There are work colleagues who seem friendly enough, but then pull away from us and perhaps even work intentionally to cause us damage, maybe from jealousy or in response to a perceived injury. The worst personal foe, in my experience, is the one who causes harm to someone I love. There is a powerful mama bear inside of me, and that bear comes roaring out in the event of a perceived threat toward my children, my family, my close friends. My instinct to fight a perceived combatant is so strong in those moments, even though I fancy myself a peaceful, even-tempered person. The Baha'i faith teaches you must show forth tenderness and love to every human being, even to your enemies, and welcome them all with unalloyed friendship, good cheer, and loving kindness. I remember asking a mentor when I was in my 20s, how exactly does one learn to love enemies? As a Zen Buddhist, he offered me this advice: learn to see where your adversary hurts. Then you will be able to have compassion on them. David had been a member of the church for many years when, as a relative newcomer, I met him in the choir, and I found him friendly enough, if a bit reserved. It was rumored that he was a high-end donor, and folk treated him with some deference. One Sunday, at a crowded and lively intergenerational service, I noticed that a little boy I knew to be on the autism spectrum was really enjoying the music. He stood up in the aisle and he danced, and he occasionally laughed out loud, and he tried to sing along. His joy was infectious, and I didn't mind that his enthusiasm was boisterous and a bit distracting. But David did. Suddenly, he got up and made a beeline for the child. I watched the man's angry face as he leaned over and spoke to the boy's mother, and I saw her react with shock and dismay. She stood up quickly with her coat and purse, grabbed her son by the hand, and as he wailed in confusion, she marched out of the sanctuary. I jumped up and pushed past several seats to go after her, as did several others who had also witnessed the incident. We caught up with her as she paused in the foyer with her hand on the exit door, tears streaming down her face. He said Dylan was too loud, that I should take him out, that he was an embarrassment. She cried in mortified indignation. We surrounded her with love and tenderness and caring words, lots of hugs. And we convinced her to bring Dylan back into the sanctuary. And we sat around them as a shield of fierce affection against all challengers. In those days, before disruptive behavior policies had become popular, I went to the board president to talk about this. He was also a dad and an RE teacher, and he and several church leaders confronted David to tell him that his behavior was unacceptable. I found out that he had a history of publicly shaming parents and children, and that leaders had been trying to discourage his unfriendly confrontational reactions for years. Now, parenthetically, I do understand the very real struggles some people have hearing the service over the noise of energetic children. Creating a welcoming space for both the hearing impaired and the vocally exuberant is an ongoing challenge in every church. But an intergenerational service is designed to include young children, and the adults who attend should understand and relax their expectations a bit. I also discovered other things about David. His wife had been living in a nursing home for some years with dementia, and they had no children. While his loneliness and loss did not excuse his rudeness, it opened a little crack in my own anger toward him and allowed a little compassion in. Then, about 6 months later, David had a severe stroke, which left him in a wheelchair with significant disabilities. And not long after that, I ran into Dylan's mother, who told me she had just taken a casserole to David's house where a cousin was helping to care for him. In response to my surprised expression, she smiled a little sheepishly and said, "Yeah, I know. I may never entirely forgive him, but what good does it do me to stay mad at him and cling to resentment? He's in trouble now, and we're part of the same church family. Caring for each other is what we do, right?" Well, yes, right. Of course, right. It may take some effort to find where your apparent adversary hurts and to try to respond with compassion. It is more convenient to see such a challenging person as two-dimensional. It is easier to just rage against them and their behavior than to look for their pain and fear. Most people don't want to expose their vulnerabilities, and you will probably not be rewarded by the object of your efforts. Hence the expression, "No good deed goes unpunished." But the spiritual and emotional benefits of this effort are enormous. Hatred eats away at the mind and the spirit and has a damaging effect on the body as well. Nursing grudges and clinging to anger in the end will hurt us far more than our opponents. Letting go of hatred and living out of compassion is much better for us and for the world. Buddhism teaches that hatred does not cease through hatred. Hatred ceases through love. This is an unalterable law. Now, some adversaries are best loved from a distance. I am not encouraging anyone to place themselves in a situation where they may come to harm or to submit to exploitation or humiliation. Please seek safety and ask for help if you need it, and your minister might be a good place to start. As individuals and as Unitarian Universalists, we are living in a trying season, locally and nationally, which feels much like a kind of war, and we may feel surrounded by foes. In a culture obsessed with the dualities of love versus hate and friend versus enemy, we often find ourselves caught in the middle, seeking for a means of peaceful compromise. We must find healthy ways to filter the messages of hatred, and we must pursue our call to be instruments of justice and of peace. How do we accomplish both? Well, we return again and again to our beloved community through worship and small groups, through social hours and one-on-one conversation, through study and spiritual practice. We are nourished and strengthened internally by our congregation. That is our community, our family of choice. Our beloved community also equips us for the work of justice, and justice forging and peacemaking make us feel empowered and strong. We can set healthy boundaries for the more challenging members of our church community, and some days we might each be one of those challenging people, right? And we can take the opportunity to learn more about love and compassion, beginning with looking deeply and courageously at those apparent adversaries to find their pain and their fear. It's easy to keep our friends close, but it takes real commitment to our Unitarian Universalist values to embrace and hold our enemies closer. May we be filled with loving kindness. May we be whole. May we be filled with loving kindness. May we be whole. May we be peaceful and at ease. May we be well. Amen. Shalom. Blessed be.
By Frederick E. Gillis. May the love that overcomes all differences, that heals all wounds, that puts to flight all fear, that reconciles all who are separated, be in us and among us, now and always. Amen. Blessed be.
Shalom.